This video will talk about the two types of anaerobic respiration, alcohol fermentation and lactic acid fermentation. This video will help you describe the purpose, conditions, and reactions of anaerobic cell respiration. The last video dealt with glycolysis. The goal of glycolysis is to make ATP, but two other products are made as well, NADH and pyruvate. NADH and pyruvate represent the branch point between aerobic and anaerobic cell respiration. Today, we'll explore the pathway of anaerobic cellular respiration. Anaerobic cell respiration has two paths in and of itself. One path is lactic acid fermentation, and the other path is alcohol fermentation or ethanol fermentation. Organisms can do one or the other, either lactic acid fermentation or alcohol fermentation. Both pathways use up pyruvate and NADH and have similar goals, but go about accomplishing those goals in different ways. Let's take a look at those fermentation pathways side by side. Remember, glycolysis is considered the first step in either pathway. What we're looking at here is the part after glycolysis. Alcohol fermentation is done by bacteria and yeast. People have harnessed the power of bacteria and yeast to help us make wine and beer, and also alcohol fermentation is what makes bread rise. The reason why bread doesn't taste all boozy is because when you bake the bread, all of the alcohol evaporates out. Lactic acid fermentation, on the other hand, is done by animals, fungi, and bacteria. People figured out how to use lactic acid fermentation to help them by turning milk into yogurt and milk into cheese. And when we overwork our muscles, our bodies switch to lactic acid fermentation mode as well. Taking a look at the overall equations, you can see that both types of fermentation use the same reactants, pyruvate and NADH. Both processes make one product in common, NAD. The other products are where each process gets its name. Alcohol fermentation makes carbon dioxide and ethanol. Ethanol is an alcohol. Lactic acid fermentation makes lactic acid as a product. Let's take a closer look at alcohol fermentation. The purpose of these chemical reactions is to regenerate NAD so that glycolysis can keep going. This diagram has glycolysis on top. Glycolysis makes that ATP but also kicks out the products NADH and pyruvate. And now alcohol fermentation takes over. Alcohol fermentation first converts pyruvate into acetaldehyde. Then, acetaldehyde takes electrons back from NADH. After this electron transfer has taken place right here, the products are ethanol, carbon dioxide back here, and NAD. The NAD is used again in glycolysis. The cell gets rid of the alcohol and carbon dioxide by diffusion. Since alcohol is useless for the cell as an energy source, alcohol fermentation is sometimes referred to as a dead-end process. Since alcohol fermentation involves electron transfer, this is a perfect example of a redox reaction. In this reaction, NADH, the electron carrier, transfers those electrons to acetaldehyde. For simplicity's sake, let's think of acetaldehyde as pyruvate, and say that NADH transfers its electrons to pyruvate. So, using oil rig, NADH is oxidized when it loses electrons. Pyruvate is reduced when it gains those electrons from NADH. Now let's look at lactic acid fermentation. This diagram is set up just like the last slide where glycolysis is shown along the top. The pyruvate and NADH products of glycolysis react in lactic acid fermentation. Electrons are transferred from NADH to pyruvate, giving the products of lactic acid and NAD. Again, NAD is used in reaction 6 of glycolysis to keep glycolysis going. Lactic acid can leave the cell by simple diffusion, but organisms that can also do aerobic cellular respiration use lactic acid even better. In an organism that does aerobic cell respiration, lactic acid can stick around, so that when oxygen is available later, the lactic acid can be turned back into pyruvate. Then, that pyruvate can just continue along the aerobic pathway in the Krebs cycle. Again, let's think about redox reactions. In lactic acid fermentation, electrons are being transferred from NADH to pyruvate. So, NADH is oxidized and pyruvate is reduced. I just want to stress this part again. Glycolysis is part of aerobic and anaerobic respiration. I've been using fermentation and anaerobic respiration interchangeably, and that's okay. Glycolysis is the part that generates ATP. Then the rest of anaerobic respiration regenerates NAD to keep glycolysis going. What happens after glycolysis is the branch point that depends on the organism and the organism's conditions. After glycolysis, if there's no oxygen or the organism just can't do it, then fermentation happens. After glycolysis, in organisms that can do aerobic cellular respiration and have enough oxygen, after glycolysis is the link reactions, then the Krebs cycle, then the electron transport chain. Let's consider our basic questions here. What's the overall reaction? Where do the reactants come from? Where do the products go? And where in the cell does this happen? The overall reaction equations are shown here. For both types of fermentation, the reactants are pyruvate and NADH. For both, one product is NAD. Where they differ is the other product or products. Alcohol fermentation has the additional products of carbon dioxide and the alcohol ethanol. Lactic acid fermentation has the additional product of lactic acid. If you notice, both of these reactions have 2 of everything, 2 of each reactant and 2 of each product. We need to think about where these reactants are coming from. For both pyruvate and NADH, the source was glycolysis, and we need to remember where the products are going. For both of these, NAD is going back to reaction 6 of glycolysis. As for the other products, ethanol, carbon dioxide, and lactic acid, they can all just diffuse out of the cell as waste products. But the special case is for lactic acid. Remember, in some organisms, lactic acid is just a waste product to be gotten rid of, but in organisms that can also do aerobic cell respiration, lactic acid can be saved. Later on, when there's a bunch of oxygen, that lactic acid can be turned back into pyruvate. Finally, where do these reactions take place? All reactions of anaerobic cell respiration take place in the cytoplasm. Let's recap. Fermentation or anaerobic cell respiration is done by organisms that either can't do aerobic cell respiration or by aerobic organisms that don't have enough oxygen right now. The goal of fermentation is to regenerate NAD for glycolysis by doing redox reactions. There are 2 types of fermentation, alcohol and lactic acid fermentation, that differ by the waste products they make. They don't differ by their reactants and their goal of remaking NAD.